Deep inside a rain-soaked alley, a starving little girl scavenged through the garbage, unaware that her uncle, a hardened Hell's Angel, had just pulled in. Finding his missing niece was a miracle, but wiping the grime from her trembling hand revealed a stamped message that made his blood run cold. $25K, or else. What followed was a ruthless retaliation, as 191 bikers united to break every law in the book. The torrential downpour in Oakland that Tuesday night felt less like weather and more like a punishment. Jax Miller, a 15-year fully patched member of the Hells Angels, rode his customized Harley-Davidson Dyna Street Bob through the flooded industrial district. The roar of his V-twin engine echoed off the empty brick warehouses, a lonely mechanical beast prowling through the dark. Jax was a mountain of a man, his leather cut soaked through, the iconic Death Head logo on his back slick with rain. He had taken this detour near the rail yards to clear his head. His sister, Sarah, had been missing for 3 weeks. Jax and Sarah had grown apart. She chose a quiet, struggling life, working double shifts at a diner, while Jax chose the brotherhood of the club. But family was blood, and the silence from her phone had begun to gnaw at his gut. As Jax downshifted to take a tight corner behind a derelict meatpacking plant, his headlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the rusted hulks of overflowing dumpsters. A sudden movement caught his eye. A small shadow, no taller than a fire hydrant, darted behind a pile of discarded wooden pallets. Jax squeezed the brakes. The bike fishtailed slightly before coming to a heavy halt. He kicked the stand down. His heavy combat boots splashed into an ankle-deep puddle as he unclipped the heavy maglite from his belt. "Hey," Jax called out, his deep voice carrying over the sound of the rain. "Who's back there?" No answer. Just the frantic rustling of wet garbage. Jax took a slow step forward, the beam of his flashlight sweeping over the debris. The light settled on a figure huddled against the brick wall. It was a child. She was clutching a half-eaten, rain-soggy bagel to her chest like it was gold. Her clothes were little more than filthy rags, her blonde hair matted with grease and mud. Jax lowered the light, not wanting to blind her. "Kid, you shouldn't be out here. It's freezing." The little girl looked up, her blue eyes wide with sheer terror. The moment the ambient light caught her face, Jax's heart slammed against his ribs. The breath rushed out of his lungs. He dropped to his knees right there in the filth. "Lily?" he choked out. It was his niece, 7-year-old Lily. He hadn't seen her in nearly a year, but those were his sister's eyes, looking back at him. She was shivering violently, her cheeks hollowed out from starvation. "Uncle Jax?" she whispered, her voice barely a raspy squeak. "Jesus Christ, Lily," Jax muttered, tossing the flashlight aside and pulling off his heavy, dry leather jacket to wrap around her tiny, freezing frame. "Where is your mother? Where's Sarah?" Lily began to sob, dropping the dirty bagel. She reached out to cling to Jax's shirt. As her tiny, dirt-caked hand gripped his collar, the glow from a distant street lamp caught something unnatural on the back of her pale hand. Jax gently took her wrist. "Hold on, sweetheart. Let me look at this." He turned her hand over. There, stamped deeply into her delicate skin with brutal, permanent-looking purple ink, the kind used by bouncers at seedy underground clubs or butchers marking meat, were 3 lines of text. Sarah's debt. $25,000. Or else. A wave of cold, murderous rage washed over Jax. The edges of his vision literally went red. This wasn't just a threat, it was a brand. Someone had taken his sister, stamped a ransom note onto a 7-year-old child's flesh, and tossed her into an alley to eat scraps. "Lily, who did this to you?" Jax asked, his voice trembling with a terrifying, contained fury. "The bad men," she sobbed into his chest. "They took Mommy in a big black van. They said Mommy owed them paper. They stamped me and pushed me out the door. They said if Mommy doesn't get the paper, they're going to put her in the ground." Jax didn't ask another question. He didn't need to. He scooped his niece up in his massive arms, wrapping the leather cut tightly around her to shield her from the biting wind. He placed her sideways on the seat of his Harley, straddling the bike and keeping her securely tucked against his chest inside his vest. "We're going home, Lily," Jax said. He fired up the Harley. The engine screamed as he ripped the throttle open, tearing out of the alleyway. He wasn't going to the police. The police asked questions, filled out paperwork, and let people slip through the cracks. Jax was going to the one place in Oakland where loyalty was absolute and violence was a promised currency. He was going to the clubhouse. The Hells Angels Oakland clubhouse was a fortress. High cinder block walls topped with barbed wire, heavy steel doors, and security cameras covering every angle. When Jax blasted through the front gates, the heavy irons slamming shut behind him, the courtyard was relatively quiet, just a dozen bikes parked under the overhang, and a few prospects smoking by the door. Jax killed the engine and carried Lily inside. The main bar area was thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of classic rock from the jukebox. About 30 fully patched members were scattered around, playing pool, drinking, and talking business. When Jax walked in carrying a filthy, shivering child, the room went dead silent. The jukebox seemed to fade. Pool cues were lowered. Jax, Big Dave, the chapter president, stepped out from the back office. Big Dave was a legend in the California biker scene, a towering, bearded man with scars mapping his face from decades of turf wars. "What the hell is this, brother?" "It's my niece, boss," Jax said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "My sister Sarah has been missing for 3 weeks. I just found Lily digging through a dumpster behind Rusty's diner." Jax walked over to the heavy oak bar, gently setting Lily down on a bar stool. He motioned for the bartender, a grizzled old biker named Pops, to get her some hot soup from the kitchen. Then, Jax gently lifted Lily's small hand and turned it so the harsh overhead lights caught the purple stamp. He didn't say a word. He just let the brothers look. Big Dave stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. He leaned in, reading the stamp. $25,000. Or else. The silence in the clubhouse shifted. It was no longer a confused silence. It was the suffocating, heavy quiet that precedes a hurricane. Every man in that room lived by a strict code. You fight men. You go after rivals. But you never, ever touch a child. "Who?" Big Dave asked softly. "I don't know yet," Jax said, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to shatter. "But they took my sister, Dave, and they marked her kid like a piece of cattle." "Tommy," Big Dave barked, not taking his eyes off the little girl. Tommy Mitchell, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, stepped out of the shadows. "Yeah, boss. Get the club doctor down here right now to look over the kid. Then lock down the compound. Nobody leaves." Big Dave turned his gaze to the rest of the room. "Call a church. Now. Every patched member in the Bay Area. Wake them up." Within 2 hours, the clubhouse was packed, shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with tension. The club's intelligence network had been working the phones, shaking down street-level snitches, and calling in favors from the Russian mob and local shot callers. The break came from a terrified street dealer named Benny, who Tommy cornered in a local dive bar. Benny spilled his guts. The purple ink, the specific font of the stamp, and the black van, it all pointed to one crew. "It's Mickey O'Connor," Tommy announced to the packed room, standing next to the long wooden table where the officers sat. A murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. Mickey O'Connor wasn't mafia. He was worse. He ran a ruthless, independent syndicate specializing in human trafficking, high-interest loan sharking, and underground chop shops. They operated out of a massive, heavily fortified auto salvage yard on the outskirts of the city. "O'Connor runs a crew of about 40 heavy hitters," Tommy continued, slamming a map onto the table. "Ex-mercenaries, dishonorably discharged muscle. They've got the salvage yard rigged with floodlights, steel gates, and armed guards. Word on the street is Sarah borrowed money to pay for some medical treatments Lily needed last year." The interest skyrocketed. O'Connor snatched her to make an example. "He stamped the kid to send a message to the rest of his debtors," Jax added, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "He's keeping Sarah alive until tomorrow night to see if the money magically appears." Big Dave stood up. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every single man. "Mickey O'Connor thinks he owns this city because he has money and a few mercenaries," Big Dave said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "He thought he could brand the blood of a Hell's Angel and get away with it. We are going to educate him." Big Dave pulled his cell phone from his pocket. "Tommy, call the Frisco chapter. Call San Jose. Call the Nomads. Tell them we have a brother whose blood has been touched. Tell them we ride at midnight." The twist, however, came an hour later. As the clubhouse prepared for war-cleaning weapons, strapping on Kevlar vests beneath their leather, Cuts Jax's burner phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Your club has a leak. O'Connor knows you're coming. He's got Oakland PD Detective Hayes on his payroll. Hayes tipped him off 20 minutes ago. O'Connor is moving the woman to a secondary location at the docks in 2 hours. You hit the salvage yard, you hit an empty nest." Jax showed the text to Big Dave. "Hayes," Big Dave spat. "That dirty son of a bitch. O'Connor thinks he's setting a trap. He thinks we're just going to blindly kick down the front door of his salvage yard while he slips out the back with Sarah." A dark, predatory smile spread across Big Dave's scarred face. "If O'Connor wants a trap, we'll give him one. He doesn't realize how many brothers are rolling into town tonight." By 11:30 p.m., the streets surrounding the Oakland clubhouse began to shake. It started as a low rumble, a vibration that rattled the windows of nearby storefronts. Then, the sound multiplied. From the north came the Frisco chapter. From the south, San Jose. From the east, the Nomads. One by one, two by two, the heavy Harley-Davidsons roared into the industrial park. The headlights cut through the relentless rain like a swarm of angry fireflies. They didn't park. They idled in the streets, a massive, mechanical cavalry waiting for the order. Jax walked out of the front gates of the clubhouse. He looked down the street. The line of bikers stretched for 3 blocks. He counted the patches. 191 Hells Angels. 191 men who had dropped everything, left their families, left their jobs, left their beds because a 7-year-old girl, with their club's blood in her veins, had been stamped like garbage. Big Dave walked up beside Jax, pulling on his heavy leather gloves. He looked at the massive army assembled before them. "Listen up," Big Dave roared, his voice carrying over the thunder of nearly 200 idling engines. "We are splitting into 2 columns. Tommy, you take 60 men and hit that salvage yard. Make enough noise to make O'Connor think the whole club is there. Keep his muscle pinned down." Big Dave turned to Jax, handing him a customized, matte black pump-action shotgun. "Jax," Big Dave said, his eyes burning with intensity, "you and me, and the remaining 130 brothers, we're going to the docks. We're going to catch Mickey O'Connor before he can put Sarah on a boat." Jax racked the shotgun, the metallic clack-clack, a sharp punctuation against the roaring engines. He thought of Lily, currently sleeping safely in the clubhouse, under the watchful eye of the club doctor and heavily armed prospects. He thought of the terrified look in her eyes and the crude, violent ink on her hand. Jax swung his leg over his Dinah Street bob. "Let's go get my sister," Jax growled. Big Dave raised his hand in the air, then dropped it. The synchronized roar of 191 Harley-Davidsons, tearing the throttle wide open, shattered the midnight quiet of Oakland. The ground literally vibrated as the massive convoy surged forward, a tidal wave of leather, chrome, and fury, splitting into 2 distinct, deadly strikes through the rain-slicked streets. The Hells Angels were going to war, and the city was about to bleed. Across town, the Oakland Auto Salvage Yard looked like a heavily fortified prison. Mickey O'Connor's mercenaries paced the perimeter behind 12-foot corrugated steel fences topped with razor wire. Floodlights cut through the relentless downpour, illuminating the rusted skeletons of stripped sedans and crushed pickup trucks. At exactly 12:15 a.m., the trap was sprung, but it wasn't the trap O'Connor had planned. Tommy Mitchell and 60 heavily armed Hells Angels didn't bother with a stealth approach. They arrived like a localized earthquake. 60 Harley-Davidsons roared down the access road, their high beams blinding the guards in the watchtowers. Instead of breaching the gate, a massive, reinforced tow truck commandeered from an affiliate shop earlier that night barreled out from the middle of the biker formation. The tow truck slammed into the main gates at 50 miles an hour. The steel doors shrieked, buckling inward and tearing off their hinges. Chaos erupted instantly. Tommy and his men poured into the yard, not to kill, but to create absolute bedlam. They threw heavy chains into the transformer boxes, blowing the electrical grid and plunging the yard into darkness. Flares and Molotov cocktails arced through the rain, igniting piles of scrap tires and oil drums. The sky turned a hellish, glowing orange. Gunfire erupted, warning shots fired into the air and into the engines of O'Connor's armored SUVs, ensuring nobody was driving out of that yard tonight. Inside the yard's command bunker, O'Connor's lieutenants scrambled for his radio, screaming into the receiver, "They're here! The whole damn club is here! We need backup!" But the backup wasn't coming, and the whole club wasn't there. 15 miles away, Pier 40 was dead quiet. The commercial docks were a labyrinth of towering, rusted shipping containers and massive, skeletal cranes that looked like iron dinosaurs in the rain. Mickey O'Connor stood under the corrugated metal awning of Warehouse 9, pulling the collar of his expensive wool overcoat tight against the damp chill. He was a lean, rat-faced man who hid behind a veneer of corporate ruthlessness. Next to him stood Detective Hayes, an Oakland PD veteran whose badge had been bought and paid for years ago. Between them, bound to a heavy wooden chair with industrial zip ties, was Sarah. Jax's sister was bruised, exhausted, and terrified, but a fierce, defiant fire still burned in her eyes. "Your brother is a fool," O'Connor sneered, pacing in front of her. His phone buzzed furiously in his pocket. He pulled it out, smiling as he read the panicked texts from his salvage yard. "They fell for it. Every leather-wearing knucklehead in the city is currently kicking in the doors of my junkyard, fighting shadows while we load you onto a freighter bound for Macau. You should have just signed the deed, Sarah." That was the twisted truth of it. The $25,000 debt was a fabrication. Sarah's little roadside diner sat on a piece of commercial real estate that O'Connor needed to complete a massive, multi-million-dollar waterfront development deal. When she refused to sell her late husband's business, O'Connor manufactured a debt, kidnapped her, and branded her daughter to break her spirit. Detective Hayes flicked a cigarette into the dark water. "Let's get this over with, Mickey. The boat leaves in 20. Put her in the container." "Help me lift her," O'Connor barked to two of his heavily armed dock guards. As the guards stepped forward, a strange phenomenon occurred. The hair on the back of Detective Hayes's neck stood up. A low, rhythmic vibration began to hum through the concrete pier. It wasn't the sound of the ocean. It was mechanical, deep, throaty. "Do you hear that?" Hayes muttered, his hand instinctively dropping to his service weapon. O'Connor frowned, peering into the wall of rain and darkness. "Hear what?" Suddenly, the darkness shifted. 130 high-beam headlights snapped on simultaneously, forming a blinding wall of white light that stretched across the entire width of the pier. The roar of the engines, which they had kept muffled by coasting the last quarter mile in neutral, was unleashed all at once. It sounded like the sky was tearing open. 130 Hell's Angels encircled Warehouse 9, their bikes forming an impenetrable barrier of chrome and iron. They kicked their kickstands down in unison, a synchronized metallic clank that echoed like a military drumbeat. O'Connor's men froze. They were outgunned, outmanned, and completely trapped. Jax Miller dismounted his Dinah Street Bob. He didn't rush. He walked with the heavy, deliberate strides of an executioner. Flanking him was Big Dave, clutching a heavy iron crowbar, and 24 terrifyingly calm nomads carrying shotguns and heavy chains. "Hayes!" Big Dave's voice boomed over the rain, dripping with contempt. "You disgrace the badge. Drop the weapon, or I swear to God you're going into the bay in pieces." The corrupt detective looked at the sea of leather cuts, the grim faces of men who had long ago made peace with violence. Hayes slowly drew his gun with 2 fingers and dropped it onto the wet concrete. He raised his hands, stepping away from O'Connor. "Coward," O'Connor spat. He grabbed Sarah by the hair, hauling her upward and pressing the barrel of a Glock 19 hard against her temple. "Back off. All of you. I'll put a hole in her right here. I want a clear path out of here." The 130 bikers didn't flinch. They didn't step back. They just stood there, an immovable wall of brotherhood. Jack stepped out from the crowd, stopping 10 feet from O'Connor. The water ran down his face, masking the sheer, unadulterated hatred in his eyes. "Jax," Sarah choked out, tears finally spilling over her bruised cheeks. "It's okay, Sarah," Jack said softly, never taking his eyes off O'Connor. "I've got Lily. She's safe." O'Connor's hand trembled slightly. "I mean it. Biker! I'll kill her!" "No, you won't," Jack said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You pull that trigger, Mickey, and my brothers will keep you alive for weeks. You won't die today. You'll die very, very slowly in a basement somewhere. Look around you." O'Connor darted a panicked glance at the crowd. Every single man was staring at him with predatory stillness. "You wanted 25 grand, Jack said, reaching into his heavy leather jacket. O'Connor swallowed hard. "This ain't about the money anymore. It's about the property." "I brought your payment," Jax continued, ignoring him. He pulled his hand out of his jacket. He didn't pull out cash. He pulled out a large, heavy purple ink stamp pad and the custom metal stamp O'Connor's men had used on Lily. Jax had found it in Benny, the snitch's stash house, earlier that evening. He tossed the heavy metal stamp. It clattered loudly on the concrete right at O'Connor's feet. "You like marking people, Mickey?" Jax asked, taking one slow step closer. "You like putting ink on a 7-year-old girl? Pick it up." "Stay back!" O'Connor screamed, his nerve finally breaking. But O'Connor made a fatal mistake. In his panic, he shifted his eyes toward Big Dave for a fraction of a second. That was all Jax needed. With the explosive speed of a heavyweight fighter, Jax lunged. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the arm, holding it. Jax's massive hand clamped over the slide of the Glock, jamming the mechanism as he wrenched O'Connor's wrist backward with a sickening crack. O'Connor shrieked, dropping the weapon. Before he could recover, Jax grabbed him by the throat, lifting the crime boss entirely off his feet and slamming him brutally against the corrugated steel wall of the warehouse. The impact shook the building. The two dock guards raised their weapons, but before they could even aim, a dozen shotguns pumped in unison, a terrifying chorus of clack-clack. "Drop 'em!" a grizzled nomad growled. The guards dropped their rifles and fell to their knees, hands laced behind their heads. Jax kept O'Connor pinned to the wall, his grip cutting off the man's air. O'Connor clawed uselessly at Jax's leather-clad arm, his face turning a deep shade of purple. "You touched my blood," Jax whispered, his face inches from O'Connor's. "You put a price tag on a child." Big Dave walked over, calmly bending down to pick up the purple ink pad and the heavy metal stamp. He walked up beside Jax. "We don't kill in front of family, Jax," Big Dave said quietly, gesturing towards Sarah, who was sobbing in relief as two bikers cut her zip ties. "Let him drop." Jax opened his hand. O'Connor crumpled to the wet concrete, gasping violently for air, clutching his shattered wrist. Big Dave crouched down next to the wheezing crime boss. He grabbed O'Connor by his designer hair, yanking his head back. With ruthless precision, Big Dave pressed the metal stamp hard into the purple ink pad. "This is from the Hells Angels, Mickey," Big Dave rumbled. He slammed the stamp directly onto O'Connor's forehead. He pressed it hard, grinding it into the skin, so the permanent ink would sink deep into the pores. When Dave pulled the stamp away, the words were emblazoned across O'Connor's face for the entire criminal underworld to see. $25,000. Or else. "Now," Big Dave said, standing up and wiping the rain from his face. "Here's how this plays out. We're taking my brother's sister home. You and Detective Hayes are going to sit right here. In exactly 10 minutes, an anonymous tip with an encrypted USB drive containing all your offshore accounts, your human trafficking logs, and Hayes's payroll receipts is going to land on the desk of the FBI field office director." Hayes groaned from the ground, realizing his life, his pension, and his freedom were entirely gone. "If you run," Jax added, looking down at O'Connor, "if you try to hide, we will find you before the feds do. And next time, we won't bring ink." The ride back to the clubhouse was different. The roaring anger that had propelled them into the night had transformed into a heavy, triumphant thunder. Sarah rode on the back of Jax's bike, her arms wrapped tightly around her brother's waist, her face buried in his leather cut, shielded from the rain. When the heavy steel gates of the Oakland compound swung open, the courtyard was flooded with light. Jax parked the bike. Before the engine even fully died, the front doors of the clubhouse flew open. "Mommy!" A tiny figure bolted out into the rain. Lily, wearing an oversized Hells Angels t-shirt that draped down to her knees, ran as fast as her little legs could carry her. Sarah practically threw herself off the bike, dropping to her knees in the wet asphalt and catching her daughter in a desperate, crushing embrace. The sound of their combined tears, the sobbing relief of a mother and child reunited, cut through the noise of the idling engines. Jack stood by his bike, watching them. A heavy hand clapped him on the shoulder. It was Big Dave. "Good work tonight, brother." Dave said, his scarred face softening for just a moment. Family is whole again. Thanks to the club, Dave, Jax replied, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't have done it without the brothers. That's what the patch means, Dave said simply. He walked away to check on Tommy, whose crew had just rolled in, smelling heavily of gasoline and smoke, grinning like maniacs. The decoy operation had been a flawless success. Jax walked over to Sarah and Lily. He knelt down beside them in the rain. Lily looked up at him, her face beaming despite the exhaustion. You found her, Uncle Jax. I told you I would, kiddo, Jax smiled. He gently took Lily's hand. The ugly purple stamp was still there, a cruel reminder of the nightmare they had just survived. But it wouldn't be a mark of fear anymore. Come on inside, Jax said, lifting Lily up while supporting his sister. Pops found a solvent in the garage. We're going to wash that ink right off. Later that night, the clubhouse was warm and full of life. The jukebox played softly. Sarah was asleep on a leather sofa in the back office, finally safe. Jax sat at the main bar, a glass of bourbon in his hand. Lily sat next to him on a tall stool, eating her third bowl of hot soup. Jax looked at her small, clean hand. The ink was completely gone, scrubbed away, leaving only slightly pink skin. Mickey O'Connor and Detective Hayes were currently sitting in federal holding cells, their empire dismantled overnight by a ghost army of bikers who left no fingerprints, no evidence, and no trace except for the permanent purple stamp on a ruined crime boss's forehead. Lily put her spoon down and leaned her head against Jax's massive arm. Uncle Jax? She mumbled sleepily. Yeah, Lily. Are the bad men gone? Jax looked around the room, at the heavily tattooed men drinking, laughing, and guarding the doors. Men who lived outside the law, but bound by a code stronger than any courtroom oath. Yeah, kiddo, Jax smiled, taking a sip of his bourbon. The bad men are gone, and they're never coming back. If this wild true crime story of outlaw justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this crazy tale with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable, gritty stories from the underground. Drop a comment below. Did the bikers do the right thing? We want to hear your thoughts.